Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeff Hunt. I'm the director of the Texas Military Forces Museum, also commander of our Living History Detachment. I'd like to welcome you to our Battleground 1863 event, where we remind ourselves about one of the great stories in American history and one of the great stories in the long saga of the Texas Military Forces, and that is the story of the war between the states. A war America fought not against a foreign enemy, but against itself between 1861 and 1865. That conflict is the bloodiest war in American history. By the time it was done, upwards of 720,000 Americans had lost their lives. More Americans died in the 4 years of our Civil War than in all other American wars to date put together. It was a war that was a watershed in the history of our country, the Great American Iliad, as it has been called, and rightly so. All the characters in that war, the great and the small, were Americans. The courage, the bravery, the skill, and the folly of the men in blue and gray was an American story. And it's a story that is not necessarily well understood today. It is a story that has been flattened and deprived of its color over the course of time. And yet it is this period of history, more than any other, perhaps even more than the American Revolution, that give America its personality, that give America its ethos. And so today we want to remember the men in blue and gray who suffered through that war, who fought its battles, by giving you a look at the realities of their life, the realities of their combat. So what you see here behind me is a representative company of Federal and Confederate infantry. And so on my left, your right, Federal troops wearing blue uniforms, and on my right, your left, Confederate troops wearing a hodgepodge of uniforms. There was a lot more variety in Confederate uniforms than Federal, largely because the Confederacy lacked the manufacturing facilities of the North and often had to make do as best it could. So while the Federal uniforms are in fact very uniform, dark blue sack coats, light blue trousers, by and large kepis or hardee hats. With the Confederate ranks, you see a greater mix of uniform colors. So we have some of the sort of tannish color. That is what is known as butternut. That is made out of jean cloth. Jean cloth is a cotton wool. It literally is the beginning of the kind of jeans that we wear today. The South had plenty of cotton, but it didn't have dye to turn that cotton into gray cloth. And so they used things like the hulls of walnuts and dyed it this dirty brown hue. Interestingly, the Confederate Army was better dressed at the beginning of the war and the end of the war than it was in the middle of the war, because in the beginning there was the material to make wool uniforms and to dye them in the color of cadet gray, which you see here. This is the actual uniform color of the Confederate Army. Late in the war, a lot of material was coming in through the Union naval blockade from England, and so the Confederates were getting dyes and dyed wool so that they could go back to the cadet gray or darker grays. But the Confederate soldier wore what he could get a hold of. Very often he wore captured Union equipment, and his headgear was typically not uniform at all. A Confederate soldier preferred what was called the slouch hat, which was basically the civilian hat that he wore, which had a broad brim, would protect you from the sun, the rain, these sorts of things, and was very, very comfortable to wear. You could also take it off and use it as a bucket in camp to draw water or rations or that sort of thing. The soldiers in both armies wore the same footgear. What these men all have on are what are known as brogans. They are the standard U.S. Army issue shoe at the start of the war, and they're a little different than the footgear that we have as civilians today, because you'll notice that all of these are square-toed shoes. Square-toed shoes. And the reason they are square-toed is because when they are issued, there is no left or right foot. And the Army did this on purpose because if you lost the heel on the shoe on your left foot, the Army could just give you one shoe Didn't have to give you a pair of shoes. It could replace that one shoe. Obviously, if you wore them long enough, they took the shape of your feet and you wound up with the left and the right. But as they were issued, there was no left or right at all. All of these soldiers are carrying their standard fighting equipment. Typically, veteran infantrymen moved very light. They didn't carry packs, maybe a bedroll, one blanket and a gum blanket, a waterproof poncho rolled into a shape, a horseshoe shape that they would have draped across their chest. That's because the Civil War soldier walked every place he had to go. And on active campaign, he might walk 20 or 25 miles a day and do that for days on end. And when you have to walk that much over dirt roads in all kinds of weather, you tend to reduce the load that you're carrying to the absolute essential. What's the absolute essential? Every soldier is going to have a canteen, either a tin drum canteen like I'm carrying here or a wooden canteen if you were a Confederate. Those were not uncommon. He's going to have a haversack made out of either cotton or wool. The haversack is what he carries his rations in. Rations were not issued cooked to the Civil War soldier. They were issued raw flour, raw bacon, that sort of thing, and you would have to cook it yourself. Typically, rations were issued 3 days worth at a time, and you would form what were known as messes within your company. 4, 5, 6 guys would get together, they would pool their food, and they would share the cooking duties. The ration for the Civil War soldier was incredibly monotonous, especially on the Confederate side. On campaign, very often on both sides, the food did not get up to the soldiers in a timely manner. It was not uncommon for soldiers to be hungry for several days at a time. And when they did get rations, the staple of that was a hard cracker called hardtack. And that hardtack very often had been sitting in supply depots for so long that it had grown mold or it had gotten weevils inside of it. The soldier simply could not throw that food away because it had those problems, and so he would toss it into a pot of boiling coffee, and the weevils would float out and come to the top of the coffee. You could skim them right off. They left no distinctive aftertaste, and you could go ahead and eat your hardtack, your coffee. The mold you would just scrape right off. Very often on campaign, the soldier was given raw pork, and he did not have time to cook it, so he ate it raw. On the march. You can understand, therefore, why intestinal problems were common for the soldiers in all Civil War armies. In addition to his haversack, the soldier is also going to have with him his tin cup. That is typically his one cooking utensil, and he carried that with him everywhere. He might have a spoon, he might have a fork, but he would always have a tin cup. That was his mess gear. After that, everything the soldier has on him is what he needs to fight. And that means his accoutrements and his weapons. So the accoutrements for the infantryman is a leather waist belt onto which he has a cartridge box that contains 40 rounds of ammunition, a cap pouch that contains the percussion caps for his weapon, and then he will have a bayonet and bayonet scabbard. And with those accoutrements, he is able to load his weapon. The soldier will then carry his musket. The Civil War actually saw a lot of weapons technological innovation. So by the end of the war, you not only had muzzle-loading weapons, you had breech-loading weapons, and you had the first repeating cartridge, metallic cartridge weapons, like the Henry repeating rifle. Everyone here, however, is carrying a muzzle-loader, and that was the standard weapon used by the soldier in the war between the states. So these are 2-band and 3-band muzzle-loading muskets, and we will be talking about those when we get later into the program. So with that, we want to move over to talking about weapons and how you load them. So, Colonel, you can move your troops on.
First platoon, right, face, shoulder, arm, forward, march.
Now, what our federal company is about to do is deploy as skirmishers. Skirmishers was a thin line of troops that would advance in front of a battle line in order to discover what the terrain was like and to uncover where the enemy was. There are many different ways you could deploy as skirmishers, but we are going to use one of the simplest methods here, and we are going to deploy on what is known as the center file. So a company is broken up into groups of 4 men. You have a front rank and a rear rank, and each one of those has a number 1 and a number 2 man, and 4 men in a square constitute what is known as comrades of battle. Comrades of battle. Okay?
Shoulder, front. As skirmishers, on the center file, by the left and right flank, take intervals, march.
So these comrades of battles move in these little knotted squares a certain distance, and then they will halt and they will deploy. They will spread out. And as soon as they're halted, they will face to the front and deploy. When spread out onto a skirmish line, each man has a partner. So the front rank men and the rear rank men work together. And they alternate in their firing and their loading so that half the muskets in a skirmish line are always loaded and ready to fire at the enemy. Most of the troops here are carrying the model 1853 infield rifled musket, which was used by both sides of the war and imported from England in large numbers. And we're going to show you how this weapon is loaded and how it is fired. Company, order arms. It takes 9 distinct steps to load a musket. And we're going to go through them one at a time. Company, load. So the soldier brings the weapon around in front of him, puts the butt of the piece facing inward so that the ramrod is facing his body. The second order is handle cartridge. Soldier reaches into his leather cartridge box and extracts 1 cartridge. Cartridge is a paper tube. In the front of that paper tube is the bullet. Then there is the gunpowder, and at the back of that tube is a little paper tail. That's very important. So the soldier takes the cartridge out, brings it up, and puts the tail at his teeth. The next command is tear cartridge. The soldier tears the cartridge, tail off. That exposes the gunpowder, and he puts the cartridge at the muzzle of the weapon. One of the few physical requirements they had for you to be in the Army during the Civil Wars that you had to have 4 front teeth, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, so that you could tear this cartridge. The order is given to charge cartridge, so the soldier pours the gunpowder into the barrel. At that point, he has facing upward at the nose of the barrel his mini bullet. And these men are each going to hold up for you a mini bullet. This is a very, very special kind of ordnance. So before the American Civil War, the standard weapon carried by infantrymen was a smoothbore musket. Smoothbore musket meant that the inside of the barrel was as smooth as the outside, and you loaded a round ball. That's why we refer to rounds when we talk about ammunition. How many rounds of ammunition you have, we harken back to the round ball. To load the weapon quickly, that ball needed to be smaller than the bore of the weapon. And what that meant is that when you put the bullet into the muzzle and you packed it down on the powder and fired it, there was no way that anything was going to make that round do anything but bounce its way out of the weapon. And whichever way it happened to be bouncing when it got to the end of the barrel is the direction that bullet took off. And so a smoothbore musket only had an effective range of about, say, 75 yards in terms of killing, although it could reach out to 200. And this is why troops were massed together in tight formations and fired by volleys, because if you have 500 guys all shooting their smoothbore muskets at once, only about a third of those bullets have any hope of actually hitting the target. Okay? So this was a problem. You had rifles. Rifles have spiral grooves incorporated into the interior of the barrel, but for those grooves to work, your round had to engage them, which meant that it had to be almost the same size as the bore, which meant loading it was very difficult. You had to have an oil patch, you had to pound the ramrod down. It could take 6 minutes to load a rifle. You got much greater accuracy, much greater range, but it took far longer to load. A smoothbore musket can be fired 3 times every 60 seconds. Rifle once every 6 minutes. So that was a problem that the military wanted to solve, and Captain Claude Monet of the French Army is the one who solved it by inventing the bullet that bears his name. This is a mini bullet. It's not called mini because it's small. This is a 57 caliber round, so it is not small at all. It's called mini, Captain Claude Monet. It has a conical nose, and it has a hollow base. And at the back of the bullet, there are 2 rings molded into the soft lead. This is smaller than the bore of the musket. So the soldier places this into the top of the weapon. We can put the bullets up. And then we take the next step, which is to draw rammer. In 2 motions, he pulls the ramrod out of the channel, spins clockwise. Everybody has to do this the same way. Again, if some guy's going clockwise, some counterclockwise. If you're left-handed, the Army teaches you to be right-handed in terms of firing your weapon. You put the ramrod on top of the nose of the bullet, and then next command, ram cartridge. You ram the bullet down onto the gunpowder and leave the ramrod there. Next command, return rammer. So in 2 motions, you pull the rammer out, spin it clockwise. In 2 motions, you return it to the channel. Now the bullet is sitting, nose up, in the breech of the weapon on top of that gunpowder. Order arms. Shoulder arms. Now, for the purposes of safety and demonstration, we're going to add a piece that's not in the routine. That is, company left face. Company ready. At the command ready, the soldier's left foot is pointed in the direction of the enemy. The heel of his left foot is in the arch of his right foot, so his body is squared toward his opponent. The lock plate of his musket is over his cap pouch. Now the order is given to pry. The soldier reaches into his cap pouch and he extracts a percussion cap. A percussion cap is a little piece of copper, looks like a hat. And on the inside of that is fulminate of mercury. If you ever played with cap pistols when you were little, this is the same thing. The soldier takes the cap and places it onto what is known the nipple or the cone. There's a hollow piece of metal that leads into the breech of the weapon. Once he has capped his weapon, he is ready to shoot. We're going to turn toward 35th Street rather than you. So, company left face. Once again, the soldier's left foot is pointing toward the enemy. The heel of his left foot is in the arch of his right. The order is given, aim. And as he brings up to aim, he full cocks his piece. When the order is given to fire, he's going to squeeze the trigger. The trigger is going to let the hammer fall onto the percussion cap. When the hammer strikes the percussion cap, it's going to ignite the fulminate of mercury, which is going to send a spark through the nipple to the gunpowder and explode the gunpowder. The exploding gunpowder is going to convert into a gas that's going to be pushed into the hollow base of the bullet. That pressure is going to take these 2 little grooves and it's going to cause the back of the bullet to kick out like a flange and engage the rifling so that as the bullet travels down the barrel, it spins like a well-thrown football. Fire! Shoulder, arms. Face by the front rank, about, face. Order, arms. You'll notice that these weapons are loud and also that they make a great deal of smoke. The term fog of war has a literal beginning. You have hundreds or thousands of these weapons being fired on a battlefield. It is quickly covered in a thick fog, and it is very hard to see. So fog of war is a literal thing. Mini bullet combined with the rifled barrel means that these muskets now have a killing range of 800 yards. So you've gone from being able to reliably kill your enemy at 75 yards to being able to reliably kill him at 800 yards if you could see him at that distance. Now, on most Civil War battlefields, you're fighting in woods and very hilly terrain, and so the typical distance at which infantry engages is 200, 250 yards. But you can still fire 3 shots a minute, at least until these weapons begin to foul because the black powder doesn't burn away cleanly, so it gets progressively harder and harder to load your weapon as the fight goes on. But once your musket fouls in a big battle, there are plenty of them laying on the ground from casualties that you can pick up and use as a replacement. What the mini bullet and the rifled musket did bring onto the battlefield for the first time is sharpshooting, or what today we would call sniping. That actually becomes possible because of the rifled musket and the mini bullet. And now we're going to reassemble our company.
Companies! Form company on the center
So the men are going to come back into their comrades of battle. They're going to face inward, and they're going to march back to form a battle line or a company front. In combat, obviously, you would do this out of sight of the enemy or behind cover, because this takes a little bit of while and you're vulnerable to fire if you're doing this within gunshot and sight distance of your opponent.
Now your leave, sir. Company, right, face. Forward, march. Right shoulder shifts, arm.
At full strength, a Civil War infantry regiment contained 1,000 men, broken into 10 companies of 100 men each. Now, very seldom on a Civil War battlefield were units that big, because disease killed thousands and thousands of men before the first battles were even fought. So in the early part of the war, a regiment was more likely to be, say, 600 or 700 men strong. By the middle of the war, you're looking at regiments that were 300 to 400 men strong, and by the end of the war, your typical regiment was probably only 200 or 250 men in strength. Whatever the size of the regiment, brigade, or division, drill was one of the most important things for the soldier. In the modern military, drill is used to teach discipline. It's used to create formations that make it easy to take one group of soldiers from point A to point B. But on the Civil War battlefield, and all the battlefields before then, drill was actually the tactics that you used in combat. The soldiers spent hours and hours and hours of drill learning the various ways to go from a column of march, which you just saw, to a line of battle, which you just saw, and backwards and forwards, and covering all the possible scenarios of where the enemy might be at any given moment, what the terrain was like, and that sort of thing. You cannot overemphasize the importance of drill for the Civil War soldier. But imagine trying to go through what we call the evolutions of the line on a battlefield like you see out here, with all kinds of terrain, all sorts of obstacles, and people deliberately trying to kill and maim you while you're having to do it. And with all of that battle smoke hanging on the ground. And that's why armies during the Civil War used flags and music. So we're going to bring out the colors. We're going to talk about flags and music on a Civil War battlefield. Now, these are not, like they are in the modern military, simply heraldry or part of pomp and circumstance. Flags and music, both drums and bugles, played an integral part to command and control on a 19th, 18th, or 17th century battlefield. So what we have brought out here are kind of the standard colors used by Union and Confederate forces during the Civil War. So every regiment is going to carry colors. In the Union Army, every regiment, infantry, battery of artillery, regiment of cavalry, is going to have two flags. It's going to have its national colors, the stars and stripes. During the Civil War, there was no standardization for the shape, the pattern of the stars on the flag. That is not standardized until 1912. So you saw some that were circles, some stars that made stars. There was a lot of variety. And then every regiment will have its regimental colors, which designate the name of that regiment. Regiments were formed by states during the Civil War. So you had a 1st Texas, a 3rd Arkansas, a 50th Virginia, a 60th New York, a 34th Indiana, for example. And so those two flags would be carried by every federal regiment. Confederate regiments tended to carry a single battle flag. And there was a lot of variety of flags in the Confederacy, depending on what theater of war you were in, the Eastern Theater, the Western Theater, the Trans-Mississippi Theater. In the Army of Tennessee, for example, each corps had a different style of flag. And that was useful because an officer on his horse could look out and say, oh, that's Polk's Corps. or that's Hardee's Corps. I know what I'm looking at. These flags, of course, would stick up through the battle smoke, and they would help the soldier know where his unit was, where he was supposed to be. A lot of the flags at the start of the war were sewn by the women of the towns and communities from which units were raised. And so literally you are carrying into battle an emblem of home made from home. In the Confederacy, you had a lot of variety, but the first flag that saw widespread use is this one here. This is what is known as the Stars and Bars. This is the first national flag of the Confederacy, and it has 7 stars on it for the first 7 states that seceded from the Union, Texas being the 7th of those states. The problem with this flag is that in combat, it looks a lot like the United States flag, especially if there's no wind blowing. And so this caused a lot of confusion on the battlefield, fire incidents, that sort of thing. So the Confederates adopted what was known as the battle flag, which is the flag that most people think of as the Confederate flag, but this was actually not the Confederate national flag. This is the Confederate battle flag. It was carried by its military units in combat. And there were several different varieties of this depending on where you were and when we're talking about in the war. On all of these flags, as the units went through various battles, they would paint or sew the names of those battles onto their flags. And so the flag was not only the symbol of home, it was also the living diary of what these units had been through, the combats that they had been in. Obviously, these flags wore out over the span of the war, and they would be replaced by manufactured flags designed purposely by the governments and issued from government warehouses. But in the very beginning, these flags were symbols of home. And they were very important to the unit because in combat, you dressed on the colors. You know that you were supposed to be in line with the colors. If your unit got shot up and it had to rally, you literally rallied to the flag. You rallied to the colors. If the colors were going forward, you knew you were supposed to go forward. If they were going left, you knew you were supposed to go left. If they were going backward, you knew you were supposed to be going backward. The greatest trophy that you could get was capturing an enemy battle flag. The greatest stain on the record of your unit would be to lose a flag to the enemy. Color bearers had therefore very short life expectancy in combat. They were obvious targets, and men were expected to give their lives to protect the colors. And so when we talk about color guards today, it's sort of a ceremonial thing. You know, the guys who march out carrying the rifles with the flag at the start of an event or something. In the Civil War, the color guard was a literal guard for the colors. They were not in the line of battle shooting. They were there to protect those colors at the cost of their life, if need be. In addition to colors, you also had another important instrument of command and control on the battlefield, and that is music. Armies had drums and bugles, not for the purposes of morale. They had bands for that. Drums and bugles were used to transmit orders through the chaos of combat. So you heard how loud those muskets were. That's 30 muskets. Let's fire 30,000 of them all at once and add in artillery and screaming shouts of command and men screaming because they've been hit and horses and mules doing the same sort of thing. So an officer literally often could not hear. I've been in reenactments where I was shouting at the top of my voice, standing right behind my troops, and they could not hear me. They could not hear my voice. And so the drum and the bugle will transmit those orders over distance, both in camp and on the battlefield. And there were many different types of drum and bugle calls for everything. For get up, for go to church, to go eat, for church call, for sick call, to advance, to double quick, to fire, to cease fire, to move by the left flank, to move by the right flank. And as if all of that's not confusing, the cavalry has its own set of bugle and drum calls, the infantry has its own set, and the artillery has its own set. And so you had to learn all of these things as a soldier. And to give you an example of some of the bugle calls that were used, a very thin slice of them, Private Gillian here is going to play some of those for you. We're going to start with the one that you would hear every morning, and that's Reveille. after that, there would be police call, there would be breakfast call, there would be sick call, and then when it came time to form the regiment, either to march off onto campaign or to drill, you would be warned that that was about to happen. There would be first call. This is, hey, everybody needs to start to get their act together because we're going to form the regiment soon. So first call. So that's basically the alarm before you hit snooze. Okay. And then when it's time to form the regiment, you're going to get to the colors. And so that's just 3 of what would be something like almost 40 bugle calls every soldier had to learn for his branch of the service. So you can understand how that sound would transmit across the battlefield when the sound of a voice could not compete with the roar of the guns. Gentlemen, march on. So now that we've looked at some of the tools of the soldier, we're going to look at the drill of the soldier. We're going to bring out our Confederate and Union companies operating together as a small battalion. A battalion could be any collection of companies, 2, 3, 4, 6, and they're going to go through drill and firings. And as they do that, we'll be explaining to you what you're looking at. Now notice the drum, that keeps everyone in step. Now we're going to go forward into line, and what that means is all of the companies that are marching forward in column are now going to swing out to form a battle line facing in the same direction that we're marching. So the battalion commander gets his units where he wants them to go. He stops the first company, and all the others swing into place alongside that company. Now this again is not a maneuver you would do in the presence of the enemy, because obviously it takes some time, you would be shot to pieces. So you would do this out of range of the enemy on the reverse side of a hill or something like that. Now the battalion has been given the order to load. Now loading in 9 times like we showed you, that was done to teach soldiers how you did it, sort of the step-by-step process. Once they have become proficient in that, you just loaded as fast as you could when the order was given. Notice the movement of the ramrods. Once a man has rammed the cartridge, he brings it up to the ready, he caps his piece, and he stands at the ready waiting for the next order.
Fire by platoon!
So fire by platoon means that subsets of the battalion are going to fire at one time.
Fire!
And this means that other parts are still loaded and waiting, so if the enemy made a sudden lunge at you, that part of the line could fire to receive the enemy attack.
Fire! Load! Second platoon, ready! Aim! Fire! Load!
Again, notice the smoke. Now what you see here is a standard line of battle. The men are in 2 ranks, standing shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow.
Ready!
These are the standard formations in the first half of the war. Now the orders have been given to fire by file. What that means that starting from the right, every 2 men, a front rank and rear rank, are going to fire their weapons. So the fire sort of cascades from right to left. And once you fire your musket the first time, then the command is automatically to load and fire as well. So load and fire as quickly as you possibly can. So learning to load and fire quickly was an important skill for a soldier, because the more lead he put out in the direction of the enemy, the greater the odds of his survival. The command has been given to cease fire, so everyone's going to come load and come to the ready. So we're going from line of battle into column of march.
Company, forward, march. High foul right, march.
So this is turning the column to the right. Notice that each successive line wheels as it makes its turn.
My platoon, into lines, march.
Now each platoon is going to go into line of battle, so what we wind up with is successive platoon lines of battle, one behind the other.
First platoon, by the right flank, march. Second platoon, by the right flank, by foul line, march. Third platoon, forward.
So what you see here is known as a column of platoons. This could also be a column of companies. It could be a column of regiments. And now from this, each one of those platoons is going to wheel into line of battle. So if you were marching toward 35th Street and suddenly the enemy appears in this trench behind you, this is one of the ways that you can turn your column of march to face the enemy. And now they're dressing the line to the right, clearing some obstacles. And you can understand why it took hours and hours and hours of drill and practice to be good at this, to be able to do it over any type of terrain in the worst possible conditions. And the ability of a unit to drill well dictated its effectiveness on the battlefield. We're going to fire by rank, which means the front rank will fire, then the rear rank will fire once the front rank is reloaded. So this is half the unit can fire at any one time. So we're going to go rear rank first. Now the rear rank's loading. Front rank, though, is still loaded. So if the enemy were to attack, you still have half your muskets ready to fire.
Front rank, ready!
You've heard, maybe read the phrase of the ramrods flashing in the sun. You're getting to look at what that means right here. So now the company is loaded and ready. Now the entire unit is going to shoot at once.
Aim! Fire! Shoulder! Arms!
And that is a company volley. Now remember, a company at full strength is 100 men.
Company,
A full-strength regiment is 1,000 men. In the Civil War, regiments were put together into brigades, which were usually 4 or 5 regiments in strength. And the typical brigade strength through most of the war was about 1,500 to 2,000 men.
My file left!
Can you imagine all of those weapons going off at exactly the same time? How much noise and smoke would be created by that discharge? Now what we're going to do next is we're going to take the company, the battalion if we will, we're going to take it onto the reverse slope of that hill in front of you, which is where it would form if it was going to attack in this direction. So they're going to form out of sight of the enemy, out of the reach of his weapons, and then they are going to launch a bayonet charge on you. So on September 17th, 1862, at a place called Sharpsburg in Maryland, you had the Battle of Antietam, so named for the creek that ran through the battlefield. Confederates tended to name the battles after the nearest town. Federals named them after the nearest body of water, so the Battle of Antietam is also the Battle of Sharpsburg. Confederate forces were holding the center of the rebel line, occupying a sunken road. A Federal division under the command of Brigadier General William F. French attacked that Confederate line and had to come up a long, steep slope. He came up in a formation where his men advanced with fixed bayonets at what was called the right shoulder shift. And the Confederates in the trench could see the bayonets of their enemy before they could actually see their opponent. And so they knew the enemy was coming at them. You can see that now, all of those bayonets up in the air. And as the enemy came forward, they waited for him to crest that hill so that when they fired straight and level, they could not miss the torso of the target they were shooting at. This is an enemy battle line coming at you the way that a soldier on a Civil War battlefield would have seen it. The idea of the bayonet, of course, is mainly to terrify the enemy, to break his morale, to make him run away. Very seldom was there actual bayonet fighting in the Civil War because usually you could shoot an attacking bayonet charge apart before it got close enough to hurt you.
Guys on line! One line, one line. Shoulder, arms. Guys on the line. Push to the left, push to the left, push left. There you go, there you go.
Then we're going to reform the line. The infantry is going to march off, and then we're going to give you insight into the artillery.
Opposite him. Forward.
And so as the infantry marches off, I want to introduce you Colonel Jim Lyons, who's going to talk to you about the loading and firing of Civil War artillery. Colonel, it's yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out. Beautiful day to be alive. Isn't that beautiful? That's an artilleryman's dream come true. You can tear that rank to shreds in a matter of seconds with these artillery pieces. The Civil War artillery was just like the infantry. Their weapons had outdated the tactics they were using. These weapons were murder weapons. These guns were built to break things and kill people, and they're still capable of doing it today. So they're very dangerous. When these guys are loading these rifles, if they have an accident, you're going to see a powder burn, maybe it may be burned finger. If you have an accident on an artillery piece, there's going to be body parts on the ground somewhere. They're very dangerous. We have to be very careful. But our job was to keep these guys from forming in the ranks like that. We did a pretty good job of it. But I'm just going to give you a condensed version of what we do. Loading this artillery is very dangerous. We had different types of ammunition we could use. If you can look up in the museum, they have some wonderful examples of Civil War artillery ammunition. Take a look at it and see how versatile these guns were. But the loading the artillery pieces was very similar to loading a musket, except they were much more dangerous. So we're going to load one and we'll go through the procedure. they will start the loading procedure. And if you watch, it's a drill just like they do on the rifles. Everybody has a job to do, and everybody has to watch the other person to make sure they're doing their job. They go into that weapon and make sure that there's no spark in that barrel. The ignition temperature of black powder is 450 degrees. If you got a spark inside that barrel, when you put a new charge in it, somebody's going to be looking for an arm or a leg somewhere because it will go off. So they clear the piece, they make sure the gun is clean, they bring up the charge. For whatever type battle situation you have, the gunner will call for various types of ammunition. In this case, we would be using canister. We could tear those formations to shreds in a matter of seconds. But if you'll notice, there's a similarity to loading a musket. Each man has a job to do. It's called a crew-served weapon. And each man has to know his drill, and he has to know the other guy's drill. Those guys standing out loading that gun are wonderful targets for riflemen. Riflemen love to pick off those artillerymen. All right, the gun is ready to fire. Each man is ready. And if you will imagine in your mind, those infantrymen coming out across that field in that tight formation, we would open up on them with this. At the beginning of the war, when they marched those men in that tight formation, that was not war, it was murder. Now we're going to do a battery fire. We'll do the same thing. Each crew, you watch each gun, it's going to load just like a rifle. Each man's got a job to do, and they all have to work together. The artillery piece in the center of the line, you can't see it very well, but that is a 12-pound 1857 light field gun. That was the mainstay of the Civil War on the Confederate and the Union side. It was a smoothbore weapon, mainly used for anti-personnel uses, and they were fantastic. They fired a shotgun shell that weighed 12 pounds. They could kill 50 or 60 men very easily in one shot. The weapon on this end of the gun is a more modern. It's called a 3-inch ordnance rifle. It was a rifled gun. It shot much further than the smoothbore, much more accurate. The gun on the far end, which you can't really see, but you're more than welcome to come look at these guns after the battle. It was a British-made 1857 Whitworth rifle gun, and it is a breech loader. It loads from the back. The men could load the gun much safer. They didn't have to expose themselves to enemy fire. And it was a very long-range weapon also.
One of the things that you'll notice here, if you watch a lot of bad movies, they're firing cannons with torches. Obviously, open flames around gunpowder, really bad idea. So in the Civil War, what you had was called a friction primer. So basically, you had the projectile, you had a cotton bag that contained the gunpowder. Once that was rammed into the breech of the weapon, you would take what was called a vent spike and push it down through a hole, and you would puncture the powder casing. And then you would put the friction primer in it. And the friction primer basically just has a piece of copper connected to a little loop to which is tied the lanyard. And when you pull the lanyard, you yank that copper out of there, and that creates friction that makes a spark that ignites the powder that fires the weapon.
All right, once again, imagine we've got all these troops coming out of these woods in tight formation, and they're going to try to take our cannons away from us. Because if your unit could capture a cannon, you got to put a set of cannons on your battle flag. It was a very great honor. It was a really important thing if you could take those guns. But we're going to try to keep them from capturing our guns. Let's see if we can stop that infantry. Thank you so much.
When we talk about fog of war, think about this. At the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the bigger battles of the war between the states, over 3 days of fighting, you had almost 250,000 men engaged in battle. You had hundreds of cannons and tens of thousands of muskets going off at the same time. So this fog of war that we talk about is something that is easy to imagine. So we've given you some idea of the weapons of the artillery and of the infantry and some of the drill. Now we're going to let you see how all of that works together, because we're going to launch a battle, a recreation of a typical engagement that you would have seen late in the war in 1864, 1865. By that point in the war, the troops had given up on these tight, dense formations that was simply too deadly. It's reasons why at the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, in a single day of combat, 23,000 men became casualties. That is the bloodiest day in American history. If you compare that to the D-Day landings in Normandy, there were only 10,000 casualties in the American Army on June 6th of 1944. At the Battle of Gettysburg in 3 days, 51,000 casualties. We fought for 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan and did not get to that level of casualties. So it was very common in a Civil War battle for an army to lose 20, 25, 30, 35% of its manpower. And so as the war progressed, tactics began to change. Armies began to dig in. So the last half of the American Civil War is a rehearsal for World War I. In addition to that, you begin to open up the formations. You use more skirmishing, and when the skirmish line wasn't heavy enough to do the job, then you used what was called open order. So instead of everybody standing shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow, you're kind of a swarm of men moving forward and firing. You could also attempt to attack the enemy in dense columns of troops so that your formation was like a battering ram, and you tried to move forward across the contested ground as quickly as possible, not stopping to fire, in the hope of hitting the enemy line, overwhelming it with mass, and then follow-up units could come in and expand the breach. And so that's the kind of fight that we're going to show you. So notice that we have an enemy trench line. Before there was barbed wire, things like sharpened stakes were obstacles called abatis. You would cut down trees, interlace their branches to make it hard for the enemy to get at you, but you could still shoot at him through that. What we're going to do here is we're going to show you a Confederate skirmish line down here in the woods to your left, which is out in front of its main works. That's a trip wire. The Confederates are there to be on the lookout for a coming attack. Federal skirmishers are going to begin to push through those woods. The Confederate skirmishers are going to retire into their trenches, and then the Federals are going to attempt to take these trenches. First, with the skirmish line, in case they're lightly held, you might be able to take them in a rush. That's not going to work, so the Federals are going to back off, then they're going to bring forward their artillery. They're going to begin to shell the Confederate position. Confederate artillery is going to respond in kind. There will be an artillery duel. Then the Federals will attempt an open order assault in line of battle to try and get at the Confederate trenches. That's going to be repulsed. And lastly, the Federals are going to assault the works in a column of platoons, trying to punch through with a bayonet charge. But that assault is going to be met by Confederate canister fire. Canister is a tin can that has about 250 musket balls in it, and it sets on a charge of powder. And when you fire the musket, the tin can disintegrates, and those 250 musket balls are spread across the battlefield in an effect not unlike a large sawed-off shotgun. There's a reason that in the second part of the war, battles became much more protracted, because breaking through trench lines was incredibly difficult. And basically, you had to find a way to maneuver the enemy out of those trenches, cut off his line of supply, and starve him into retreat, because direct frontal attack had become all but impossible. So this is what is about to play out for you. I want to remind you, as we do this, there's a danger factor out here with these open-bore weapons. They're incredibly lethal at close range. They can and will kill you. So it's important that you stay here behind the cone line until we are finished. And when we're done, I'll have a chance to come back and make a few closing remarks, and then we'll let you come out onto the field to talk to the troops, look at the artillery, and get close and personal with it.